Okay. Hi, everyone. Here, it's me again. So this week, we're going to be continuing talking about some of the ideas that we've developed over the last few weeks. Again, just thinking about how your ideas and your designs fit into the wider context, both socially, politically, economically, just really trying to get you to think a little bit more critically about all this stuff. But obviously, we're going to be thinking a little bit more about routine and continuing to think a little bit about how your relationship with your client and even with some of the factors that affect how your client experiences society and space are important. So let me just share my screen. And okay, looks like we're ready to go. So like I said, I think the point of today is to just kind of, again, emphasize the way that in which you can think about design as part of the bigger picture, but also think a little bit more about routine and how it can be effectively used to not only subvert expectations, but also like push forward a kind of a slightly more progressive or slightly more kind of like interesting way to live. Let's see how this goes. So for many of us, I think when you think about routine, and today specifically, actually, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the idea of domesticity and gendered space. So I know these are kind of, this might seem like a slightly kind of abstract term, but the main point of this is really to think a little bit about how your experiences of routine and many people's experiences of routine tend to be rooted in the idea of the home or like at least start in the home in some way or form, and whether that doesn't really matter whether you're at home living with the parents or you're renting or you're in a student accommodation. Within the home, the idea of a kitchen is still quite an integral part. And the kitchen is obviously like a space of production where you can make food, but you can cook. And if you don't cook, it's where you make tea, where you make pot noodles, don't know, and how you're living. But the point is that, the kitchen has always kind of been a key point really in homes. And whilst we might think of the kitchen as kind of like this, in modern contexts, think of it as this beautiful space, which is the anchor of the home, where you have the extension of that being the living room, the balcony, it's just kind of like these beautiful marble tops and giant kitchen islands. It hasn't always been that way. And I think that's something that I'm going to start to explore a little bit today. So this really kind of, up until the mid to late 19th century, the kitchen wasn't really a space that you'd see. It was a space that was kept out of sight. This is kind of based on the cultural understanding of the kitchen as really a space that was not necessarily occupied by the people who live in that space. It was mostly like servants who had their own quarters. And these spaces were not necessarily like, again, really visible, but they weren't necessarily either like a space that you would expect to see yourself in if you live in that. And obviously this comes with a stipulation that this is kind of looking more at the people who had higher status, people who are slightly more elevated. There's obviously lots of other discussions that go into this kind of thing. But at the turn of the 20th century, we had a kind of slightly more modern and new take on the idea of domesticity. And this was really kind of a result of many different things. It's like big giant leaps in technology, in mass production techniques, the kind of exploration of plastics. All these things kind of like came together along with other factors, which I'll get into in a second, to kind of get us to rethink a little bit more about the idea of domesticity as people kind of built their own homes and had these kind of entire nuclear families and so as this space kind of started to take shape and evolve over the course of the 20th century, specifically towards the start and middle of the 20th century, it was still really seen as a heavily gendered space. So in the way that you think about some of the promotional materials, this is a perfect example of these vintage posters. You always see kind of the woman within the kitchen, and it's in like sort of her domain, and it's this kind of almost, it describes the expectation of kind of being the mother, but also looking after the house. That was kind of her role. And so it was the idea of being a woman, your identity was really explicitly tied to the idea and your role of kind of a domestic space within the domestic space. But at the same time, women were actually becoming increasingly more and more prominent and taking a more and more prominent role in everyday society. So this is really, this is a picture from what now we call is the first wave of feminism. And towards the end of that, there was a continued exploration of these kind of hierarchies and systems that women found themselves in. But predominantly also, this really kind of went back to the idea of domesticity in the home. And so this is where I would like to introduce you to Jane Drew. Now, Jane Drew was an architect, and she kind of like worked from the early 20th century, all the way up to like the mid to late 20th century. I always get them mixed up. And she was best known for her work in Chandigarh. So this is a town planned by Corbusier. And you'll hear a lot about this in the course of the next, God knows, in the course of your engagement with architecture and architectural education, you will come across this. This comes up quite a lot. So I'll spare you the details, but she was really widely respected for her kind of contributions to this project. And in 1944, sorry, she published a brochure called Kitchen Planning. So this was really a guide to kind of start to encourage people to rethink ideas about design of kitchens. And she really kind of like acknowledged the home as a gendered space, but she focused specifically on kitchens. And you can see in this quote, she talks about how the drudgery of household work must be banished. And that was really based on the premise that she wanted women to be able to have more time and more efficiency in the kitchen to be able to go out and pursue their own careers and kind of like really work essentially. And this was, again, within the context of the time, this is really important because this was the beginning of a shift away from the idea of kind of landed gentry, people who had generations of wealth passed down, and kind of the status of the elite, and like your wealth being equated to how much property you own. And it was the first time where being employed or work was seen as a sign of liberation and freedom, and women at that time were really kind of trying to get in on that. So Jane Drew really argued that while she might not be able to completely upend the social hierarchy that was kind of in place, she could at least help to set the scene for a better relationship to the idea of domesticity to the home. One where the kitchen would no longer be really a space to oppress women, to hide them away, but rather kind of a space to empower them. And she did this by focusing a lot on, she did a lot of research in kitchens. She kind of studied a lot in the UK. She went over to America, looked at like different granite tops. She kind of really did a lot of research to understand these things. And I think this is where some of your studies into routine could start to kind of be a little bit more influenced as well, to kind of link it back to what we were thinking about. So, I mean, this is an example of one of her kind of like diagrams that she produced in Kitchen Planning. I can't find the full version of it, but I can find some images. And this diagram really stuck with me actually when I first saw it a couple of years ago, which is why I remembered this whole topic. She looked at circulation and uses in the kitchen, but she also talked to a lot of women. She surveyed them about different aspects of what she called as kitchen life, and as well as kind of looking at different things like the average height of women, which is not necessarily something people were looking for, So in her findings, she kind of talked a lot about how the kitchen was not really seen as this kind of logical set of steps, but it was more just sort of a lot of wasted miles walking from one point to another. And this is what this diagram presents here. So if you look on the left-hand side, you can see this kind of traditional or original view of what the kitchen looks like. And you can see she kind of mapped out these key positions where you might be standing and then the routes in between them. And so this refers to the wasted miles that she's talking about. And in her kind of proposal, she kind of rearranged the items in the kitchen and thought about how you can maximize efficiency. And this, again, this is another kind of, this is a really useful tool. I think it's a tool that's been continuously used since her kind of idea, and it's based on management techniques and stuff like that, time in motion studies. But again, it's a really interesting example of how she thought about this problem from a social perspective and thought about routine and how to maximize it to be able to liberate people and liberate their time. And one of the great things about this is that actually you can see the influence on modern kitchen planning based on some of these visuals and some of these plans and studies. So in this example, again, if you look at on the right hand side, you can see that the kitchen table has been moved from the side onto the middle, which it looks like it was one of the first steps which kind of eventually became solidified into the kitchen island. I don't have any evidence for this, but it just I saw that and I remembered that. And in another one of her kind of like, as a result of her work and some studies, she ended up developing a set of sort of modular plans. So the idea for her was that kitchen could be mass produced to be able to cut across class, which is another topic we won't even get into. And she then started to suggest how the kitchen could become more visible. It could become a bigger part of their everyday life. And this is essentially the start of the sort of open plan house that you can see. But still, if you still want to critique some of her work, she did understand that she was still not necessarily upending the system. And even in her drawings, you can see that the woman was still the sole occupier of the kitchen, whereas the man was sitting there waiting, presumably after coming back from work, and the kids would be occupied. So there's still, the gender role still played out, but through her exploration of space, she still managed to think about this. So it is really through her kind of like examination of routine of scale of domestic space, that she kind of managed to build this new set of rules for better quality kitchen spaces. And clearly they have had some influence on the way we think about space today. Obviously, there's a lot more to be said about this, and there's a lot of, like, for example, there's a big undercurrent of class politics that she gets into in her analysis and some of her ideas, because there was, even during the 20th century, the idea of class was still kind of pervading all the way through different aspects of living and domesticity. But you can read more about that in the reference paper that I'm referencing, which is here. I've added it to the reading list. If anyone's interested in reading more about Jane Drew's research, but also reading a little more about the contemporary, the context of the time in terms of gender and how that played into it. So the point of this really was to demonstrate how, if you think about things historically and within the, like, specifically, if you think about how politics can actually still seep into the everyday of the design, right? Kind of like, it can still shape the way we live, and it can still shape the way that we find ourselves in the spaces, but it can also influence how societies can come together in those systems that these kind of like positions of power have given, right? So to kind of put that in a slightly more straightforward way, you know, like, the idea of politics and the idea of social context still plays a big role in how design can come through. And through questioning routines, you are able to start to think a little bit more about certain levels of either injustices or kind of like spatial tactics that may be employed by positions of power institutions to be able to either oppress or kind of maybe even empower certain groups. But the idea really is just this routine is inherently a very deeply personal and subjective experience. And that's the case with almost any really lived experience. It is really hard to understand what it is like to experience space as an outsider. And, you know, in Jane Drew's research, she talks about the fact that men are not necessarily sympathetic to the plight of the woman who has to kind of deal with the drudgery of the kitchen. She talks about the drudgery of the home, because they're always out working. And so to kind of like, I think basically I have an exercise and I have some homework for you all. And it's to try and kind of think along these lines. So we're going to be asking you to pair up and swap routines with each other for a day. And as you go about your day, just please make sure that you're taking kind of a list, or keep a notebook with you where you take kind of a list of notes, think a little bit more about key moments, any realizations that you may have, any ideas that you liked or didn't like throughout the day. And again, this is kind of a journaling process as you experience someone else's routine, not necessarily literally, but, you know, just follow their routine. If someone catches the bus to school, go catch the bus instead of riding the bike, or, you know, just kind of try and really live through the other person's life and see how different kind of ways that these play out in. And yeah, so I look forward to really hearing about your experiences in next week's session. Obviously today I think I'd like to focus the conversation a little bit more on Jane Drew's work and some of her kind of questions that she raised. So I have, as usual, I have 3 questions. So the first one is, do you think that Jane was really successful in helping reimagine the kitchen as a space to empower women? You know, she did revolutionize the idea of kitchen space, but did she really actually change much in the overarching, in the world, in the general scheme, right? Did she do it? How else do you think that you can apply some of the ideas that Jane developed in her research today? So, you know, some of her kind of spatial studies, some of her kind of drawn studies, how do you think that you can apply that in today's context? You know, how is it different in other contexts, not just in the kitchen, but also maybe in public transport, maybe in I don't know, in the living room? Start to think a little bit more about that. I'd like to kind of push you a little bit, think a lot about that. And then a slightly more general question, I think that I would like you to continue thinking about, obviously past today and into next week, as you kind of go on and as you try out other people's routines, is if you could change one thing in your own routines, how would you do it? So it's not necessarily what would you change, but how would you change? You know, the idea of routine is that it's almost baked into our everyday. So what would be the design? How can you design incentives to really kind of push you to change that routine itself? And yeah, so these are the 3 questions. You know, they'll be on the board, but I'm really looking forward to kind of hearing what you all have to say and what you have to think. But anyway, in the meantime, I'll see you very soon. Take care. Bye.